I am Anarta Bashaliva along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and program producer Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine and also introduction will be from Professor Victor Fett. Thank you.
Вітаємо наших слухачів з України глибоким уклоном. Ми є свідками ваших великих страждань, а також вашої великої сили. Дякуємо за участь у нашій щотижневій програмі. I am honored today to introduce to M-Ukraine program at our 77th weekly meeting, Katya Margolis, who joins us from Europe. She is an artist, illustrator, activist, blogger, and her name probably is one of the most recognizable today on Russian social media. I should say international social media, which uses Russian language, not within Russia only, mostly outside. Katya joins us to talk about Russianism, the new word for this planet, but very well-defined branch of fascism now presiding over the war in Ukraine. Her many credentials are from Moscow, from Italy, from Australia, from many international institutions of higher learning. She is also a professor in Latvia Online University. But over the last year and a half, she was and became very active in exactly telling the world about this war from the position of a person in a free world. And we met over internet, over Facebook. And again, I'm very honored to have her today present in English to our audience. Welcome, Katya.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you for that invitation in this general presentation. I'm very honored to be here, to be able to speak not only on behalf of myself, but to speak on a subject that is still subject to big discussion, the term that's subject to big discussion, although it should seem pretty obvious to our Ukrainian audience. As we know, the term Russianism has been legally acknowledged by Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine and also used by some historians and academics, but it's still not widely used term. And what I want to say is not about the term, because I was recently reading, that's a very quick introduction, I was recently reading this very powerful essay by Oksana Zabushko, whom I was honored to meet briefly last year in Italy, who just published an essay book, actually, on the full-scale invasion. That's called in Italian A Lungo Viaggio. I know it's published also in Ukrainian and English, and she starts by talking about words. And as a linguist myself, a writer, and somebody who is deeply concerned with words, I think words are not just words, we all know. Although even in the terrible and catastrophic and criminal events like the Russian invasion and Russian action in Ukraine, a lot of people became speechless, a lot of writing, and people became speechless, and I want to honor memory of Victoria Amelina, who was recently killed by a Russian missile attack in Kramatorsk, and she was supposed to go to Paris to write her new book that will be never written, unfortunately. And she was in one of her interviews, I think, The Guardian, just before her tragic death. She was talking about her starting to write poetry. She always wrote prose in Ukrainian. She's been translated in many languages, and she said that she'd been writing poetry. But what seems poetry? Are these just small remains, like relics, like ruins of the language that that she was left with to express something that was beyond words? And now I want to get on the other side of the same word discourse and tell you a few words about the Russia's. Recently we prepared a manifesto. We're not a political party or anything, we're just free thinkers, public intellectuals, artists, writers. People are signing this manifesto right now. It's been translated to 12 languages on the website stoprushism.com. It's in English, in German, in French, in Ukrainian, obviously, in Bulgarian now, in Czech, in many languages. And I wanted to state in 10 small, quick points, paragraphs, what we think is essential to formulate, not because these words themselves can change the reality of this war. We're not fighting, we're trying to contribute to the army.
No sound, and I think you need to try to reload to come back.
Okay, yeah.
Yes, we're here.
So let's continue here. And so I will, if you have the text,
We
but
do.
I want just to comment a few things as we go, so it doesn't seem just void and general. And what we're trying to do there, after all the terrible events, after everything we've seen, we're trying to find words that would be able to encompass some big general picture that we see. We as authors of this manifesto, I was in the initiative group and the author of the beginning, but then Ukrainian philosophers and other people joined us. You can see those first 25 signatures on the website, and now we have almost 1,000 signatures that we'll add soon. So, Stop Russianism, Present Future, the Venetian Manifesto. We desire not simply the termination of the war, but the complete victory of Ukraine and the total defeat of the Russian Federation. We desire the restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty over its entire territory and the provision of international guarantees for its security. We desire an international trial for Russian military criminals and the payments of reparations. Any peace must be made on Ukraine's terms and with the consent of the Ukrainian people. Only a peace brought about on these terms can be strong and just. So I think, as you can all easily recognize, not talking of us without us is a general slogan and main point in any colonial, post-colonial and discussion, and that's what and this kind of not quite articulated but condescending sometimes, even with all the compassion towards Ukrainian people and the victims, we see somehow this condescending attitude to poor Ukrainians who need help and advice on how to proceed towards peace, which I personally find totally unacceptable. Even Ukraine being the victim of the Russian aggression, Ukrainian people and Ukraine proved itself to be the hero of our times and the defender of what I strongly believe of civilization, European values, and democratic values against the barbarism that Russia is demonstrating. Because what is confusing for many people, not only in the West, but also within the Eastern European world, is this somehow still dominating myth of this great Russian culture and the great deep Russian spirituality, and you've all heard these kind of cliches. And I think it's the right time for people, especially people engaged with culture and writing and art, to ask themselves what is so great or what is so defective about the culture that lets itself so easily to be instrumentalized and brutalized by the authority and totalitarian governments through the centuries. It's not a kind of tragic event and a single occasion that Putin came to power and somehow put down on the knees and repressed clever people and dissidents and free thinking and press and the freedom of everything. It's a recurrent, if we look back in the Russian recent history, it's a recurrent problem. And Russian intellectuals tend to see themselves as equal victims of this process, instead of taking a different view, which I strongly argue people to think about, is to take some kind of responsibility. And at this point I want to point out there's a big difference between blame and responsibility. While guilt and blame are to be referred to the past, and it's quite a complicated issue in itself, responsibility is a vector to the future, and responsibility is a response. So I think for anyone engaged or auto-identifying with Russian culture and Russian identity in any way, whether living within Russia or outside Russia, whether immigrant for a long time or somebody who fled and recently escaped the war or the regime, it's still a question to ask oneself: how come my culture, my attitude, my right, and all these values that are stated in my mind, in my books, in my textbooks, are not applied and hasn't been properly applied at a wider range, as to not to prevent, we know very well that art does not prevent barbarism, but at least to put some framework of self-reflection, self-criticism, some kind of gasoline that keeps any culture to go to develop and society to develop. Because that's one, just free speech is not enough. One needs also some kind of mirror and self-reflection. So that's my short comment, related but not directly related to this first point of our manifesto that states Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian identity as the first and the main actor, not an object but a subject of any future. And this piece brought about on that terms can be strong and just. Then we pass to point 2. This may be an absolutely necessary condition for today, but it is not a sufficient one for tomorrow. We desire a real future, not a fake one. We believe that only cessation of the existence of Russia, the Russian Federation, as an empire, and its demilitarization, including the removal of all nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, could be a real step to a safe future that would prevent similar acts of further aggression. And now here, of course, I have to stop because a lot of people were somehow not shocked, but some people had some hesitation and something to argue about, and said it was a kind of garden path sentence. In linguistics, the garden path sentence is the sentence that gives the beginning of the sentence gives one idea and creates one structure in the mind, while the rest of the sentence brings to the different idea. And in rhetorics and in public speech, people argued and not to use garden path sentences. But here we deliberately use, we desire a real future, not a fake one. We believe that only the cessation of the existence of Russia, the Russian Federation, as an empire. And it does not mean that all Russian people of Russia stop to exist. It means that in the present state, as we see it, a Russian Federation is not a federation in a proper term. Since the Chechen War, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has regained the process of deimperialization, of decolonization, has been never completed. And it hasn't been acknowledged. It hasn't passed through all the stages that we've seen empires and imperial consciousness and people to pass through. And this half-cured disease became chronic disease, and imperialism and imperial thinking, unfortunately, is a very typically deeply rooted and ingrained in the Russian mentality of all social stratas, not just active military criminal war defenders, but also, unfortunately, the war opposers, the oppositions of the Putin regime. They still, a lot of people, so-called, should be, a lot of people say cannot acknowledge their imperial attitude, imperial optics, imperial speech, and as the war proceeds, we hear it more and more. And of course, in this respect, Russian mentality, and I strongly suggest that intellectuals, Russian intellectuals, are still very much behind. And that's also a task of culture, of education, to de-imperialize the consciousness. Because this disease, this chronic imperial disease, this went through centuries, and Ukraine is not only the only victim of that. We know that very well. The minorities within Russia itself, we know all the acts of aggression to the Baltic states, the Chechen wars, Russian aggression and crimes towards Chechen people. Recent 15 years ago, aggression, occupation, accession of a part of the Georgian territory, and many other occurrences. And if we look at this, thing altogether, we can see that it's not that every time it's not a single occasion. There is something in common within this. So we need to switch off this. Something wrong. There's not a single occurrence of some terrible sequence of events that leads to repression, to war. There is a cycle. And this cycle needs to be broken, and the only way to break it, larger scale, is to break this mental cycle. Because unfortunately, this discourse, this attitude, these subconscious attitude to other people, smaller peoples, are deeply, as I said, ingrained in the Russian mentality. Next thing is point number 3. We want analysis, deconstruction, and eradication of Russianism in all its forms. We understand Russianism as a distinct ideology and practices established in the 21st century by the regime of the Russian Federation, a regime that is cynical, aggressive, misanthropic, and dangerous to the planet. Again, here just a small comment. A lot of people react instinctively to Russianism, something as racism. They can see the kind of ethnic root in the word itself, Russia. But what we mean, and historians like Timothy Snyder, for instance, mean by Russianism, is that that's a form of fascism that's being transformed within the Russian state, RU. It has nothing to do with ethnicity, but it does have to do something with the mentality of the state and the mentality of the people as conveyed by the state. So number 4 is very important because we're trying to find a formula that would explain what Russian is. We see Russianism as being deeply rooted in historical Russian imperialism, as I said it before, which has persisted and has even intensified in the expansionist policies of the USSR and the Russian Federation. It has become a fundamental and constitutive element of the official ideology and the basis of the unofficial consensus within Russia. And that's the second part that I want to underline, that it's not just the propaganda, but it's a propaganda that's been planted and grown on a very, let's say, fruitful soil prepared by generation of non-cured imperialism. Today's Russians relies on the traditional political practices of the Russian Empire / USSR, including the policy of exercising absolute control of special services in all spheres of Russian society, inherited from communist totalitarianism, as well as systematic organization of subversions and terrorism abroad. Again, there is nothing new about it. We know the history of the KGB, various lot of stories of the KGB in the Soviet time, in the time of the Cold War and the Iron Curtain, and actually nothing has changed. It was like people and dissidents were killed by poisoned umbrellas, now they're killed by polonium, but it's the same kind of trying to control, trying to interfere, trying to destabilize the world around Russia, as well as taking advantage of any kind of weaknesses and trying to manipulate people, trying to recruit people to KGB, and this war demonstrated even a step further. They're now recruiting, as you know, they're now recruiting officially, half officially, recruiting the criminals, the convicted criminals to participate in the war, to be in exchange for the promise for them to be free afterwards, which is completely illegal, but there's nothing legal in the modern day Russia, unfortunately. So we go to the point 5. We're convinced that though there are certain similarities, Russianism differs from fascism. Fascism is amoral, while Russianism is immoral. It is built on fundamental nihilism. Fascism relies on inhuman ideological convictions. While Russia is ideologically cynical, its officially declared ideological foundations are nothing more than formal declarations, whereas in truth it feeds on the absence of any internal values and thrives on civic passivity. And that's a very important point, actually, because what we see now is different from what, if we look at the sort of Nazism, for instance, we see these big crowds crying over Hitler. We also see these scenes on the Russian TV, but actually we know very well that a lot of these manifestation happy greetings of people to play, a lot of them are staged, and people are being paid for these kind of puttings, as they call them. And what is actually feeding this war is the absence of a strong position, of a strong reaction, of any value condemnation or any kind of consciously taken position. Russia's parasites on achievements of world civilization, including the most advanced technologies. Again, let's remember the American elections and Russian interference. A lot of occurrence of Russian interference in the politics of different states. Russia's it has no historical precedence, so that radically new methods are needed to combat it. Despite its aggressive archaism, Russianism is a contemporary phenomenon. Again, I think it's very important to underline that all these online activities, all these propaganda activities using social media, big data, is not something superfluous to the Russian self. It is its flesh and soul. This everything is not clear, this disinformation, half truth, half not truth, this misleading proportion of real facts that are built together and mixed together with complete fakes. So people without strong position, critical thinking, knowledge of what of alternative sources of information are very easily fooled, even in people with best intentions. So 6, we consider it necessary to actively resist Russianism today and work towards its total dismantling in the future. We intend to work on a system of identification and analysis of Russia's narratives and their dissemination via global media, on Russia's manipulations of cultural narratives, for instance, the myth of the greatness of Russian culture, etc., global intellectual and political resources, as well as on decolonization of Russian studies. Again, the studies of Russia, the views of Russia, the science itself is very Russocentric, and that's also this bias is also due to the imperialistic view and the imperialistic status of Russia itself. Number 7, Russia brings death and suffering to the people of Ukraine. It threatens the very existence of the Ukrainian nation and political parties throughout Europe and North America, and it persistently seeks to undermine the European Union from within. Again, I will not comment longer, but anyone interested could find a lot of examples of these interference of Russia, direct or indirect, visible or less visible, to the internal and external policy of countries, and manipulation and dissemination of disagreement and alienating these small conflicts into big ones. It's actually what has always been the main KGB strategy, which remained intact, since there's been no open political process of the criminal crimes of Bolsheviks, communists, KGB. Here are the results. Point 8, Russia is also dangerous to Russians themselves. It's Russians themselves. It systematically neglects human rights, represses dissidents, destroys civil activism and participation in political life, deeply corrupts the population of Russia. Russianism has infiltrated the consciousness of Russians of various social statuses and political preferences, including those living outside the Russian Federation, which is also very important. That Russianism exists in the heads of people. It infects many representatives of so-called titular nation Russians, the ethnic Russians, with Russian ideological and day-to-day chauvinism, normalizes discrimination against ethnic minorities, homophobia and misogyny, makes Russians participants in the criminal war. We call on Russians to acknowledge their responsibility, I would say our responsibility for this war and its consequences, and to do everything in our power to combat Russianism and Russian imperialism. Number 9, we see our task not only as influencing political decisions related to the development of a new architecture of an international security, which proved itself, as I can comment, quite used in many ways, especially all new decisions are systematically blocked by the mere fact of the participation of Russia in ONU, which is quite discussable and quite disputable, since Russia inherited this position within ONU from the USSR, and it has never been actually legally processed. We also seek to work at the everyday level using existing and developing new instruments of information technologies, journalism, and social media, as well as various educational programs, in order to demonstrate the complete unacceptability of Russianism in all its manifestations, from culture to ideology, from justification to normalization, from behavioral patterns to speech cliches, and as I said before. And the last point, who are we? We're a free, horizontal international community committed to resisting Russianism today, working to prevent its repetition, revival, and diffusion in the future. We invite everyone who supports Ukraine today to join us now and participate in our work. We welcome everyone who understands that today is the proper time to create the guarantees of responsibility and non-repetition of all numerous historical precedents of Russian aggression and threat to the world at large. We have a simple and a very difficult goal to make this future present. So that's more or less, these are the 10 points, and I would gladly, at this point, we've been already half an hour through our talk, and I would be happy to invite you to any discussions or questions or comments that I'll be very interested to hear.
Thank you. Thank you, Katya. We already have questions from our viewers. Len Deutsch, please, our former graduate dean of Marshall University, Leonard Deutsch, welcome. Open your camera if you can. Len?
Okay.
Yes.
Putin seems to be obsessed with recreating through some kind of Russian imperialism, something that he perceives reflected the grandeur of Russia once. Just looking at the current Russian Federation, how many people within it actually identify as Russian? I don't know how to express that genetically or in terms of who they really are. You have this big political entity called the Russian Federation, but and he wants to expand that even more. But how many of those Russians are really Russians in the Russian Federation?
That's a very good question, actually, because what we're witnessing now, we're witnessing quite two controversial processes in the same time, as it happens with the historical witnesses. We're witnessing two processes. One is kind of the rebuilding of national Russian imperial identity, which Putin is feeding as a grandeur, make Russia great again. Sorry for the pun. But also we see in the same time, we see an opposite tendency that I believe as Russia will be losing this war, it will be a new trend, and we already see it from some clever, close collaborators of Putin regime. For instance, some oligarchs, businessmen that were quite closely involved with Putin's regime and have actually contributed to the building of this regime. For instance, Arkady Volosh, who is the head of Yandex, kind of Russian Google main numerical business that contributed greatly to, on one hand, to the development of the online services and comfort and many other quite attractive things, but also proved to be quite a useful instrument of propaganda, like doing the fake searches, like for instance, if you wanted to look up Mariupol in the middle of the bombing last year, what you would see on this Russian Yandex search would be a flourishing, nice city, and there will be no trace of any news regarding the war. So this numerical, online, high technological waves of propaganda helped Putin to build the consensus within the country. So why I remembered this Arkady Volosh, that he recently published was his online presence, and his Wikipedia article about his biography has been changed, and he's been presented as a Kazakhstan-born, so kind of colonial-born, Kazakhstan-born Israeli businessman, and any trace of Russian identity or belonging to Russia has been erased from his biography. Another good example, which is Anatoly Chubais, again, a close collaborator of Putin, who fled the country after the beginning of the invasion, kept silence, never, unlike Volosh, never condemned the war, never made any statements. He moved to Israel, and recently somebody found a paper in the conference where he was presented as an independent scholar from Glasgow. So people are trying to disguise, clever people, I mean clever in terms of not in good sense, but people who are opportunists and who understand the general tendency, they try to present themselves as a non-Russians to the exterior world as the war in Ukraine proceeds and the crimes become more and more obvious and well known, and as the public opinion is turned away from Russians, these people try to de-identify themselves. But it is, I think that's a fake state. What really needs, in my opinion, to be done is to revise the whole notion of the Russian identity, to look into oneself and who are Russians. Russians are people who identify themselves or who are being with Russian language and Russian culture and the Russian state, voluntary or involuntary. So what I think is needed is a deep revision of this Russishness and re-education, first of all, ourselves and oneself. And that's also, I think it's a big goal for the educational task, to revise the past in order to build a different future. And in order to build a different future, one needs to acknowledge the imperial essence and the presence of the imperial thinking within Russian consciousness at large. And I believe this would be possible only in the process of decolonization, maybe some refederalization. I'm not a politician, I don't know, but I think there is no way out as to dismantle the empire as it is and have all separate states, or maybe some other kind of unions that will be voluntary, legal, and not fake federalism to cover up the real imperialism. So answering your question, it is not ethnic, of course. There's nothing genetic about it. It is the problem of the continuity and non-revision of the imperialism within Russian culture and identity.
Thank you, Katya.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And more questions, please. Galina Itskovich, our common contributor, psychotherapist from Brooklyn, working with Ukrainian refugees. Galina, please.
Hi,
Unmute yourself.
great to see you here. And question, do you see any way of sorting out Russian culture from the imperial grandeur, quote unquote? Because the message is that, yes, we are the culture. And of course it's not so, but what's the way of, where do you kind of draw this line? Is it possible to draw this line now while the war is at its worst?
I think, well, it is a terrible thing that we have to talk about. It's well due. It's too late, obviously, but it's never too late. At least if one doesn't start now witnessing what we're witnessing now, then it will never happen, of course. And I do believe it is possible. It happened with, as we know, it happened in the history before, and great empires became normal states, and great literature like British or Portuguese became normal. It didn't lose any of its authors, but they should be seen in a different perspective. And I think it's a double task that can be performed, and I actually I were preparing a program for a decolonization course, just the introduction. And the first step, and I think a younger generation who are more open, more technologically advanced, of course, is also subject to propaganda, but maybe more interested in being modern and contemporary, is more open to that kind of discourse. And the first step is to change the optics. Sometimes it's not about resisting it or believing in the grandeur of this Russia. Sometimes it's just a cliche that's been put as a chip since the kindergarten in one's mind, and one keeps repeating the same things and the same cliches and formulas without actually opening and looking what they're made of. And I think deconstruction of this myth, a simple example, there are very few books, but there is a beautiful book by Eva Thompson about the imperialism of the Russian culture and literature, probably the only one, of course never translated into Russian, but translated into Polish. It's been written in English, translated into Polish, translated into Ukrainian. It's in Ukrainian, it's called Troubadouri Imperii. The original English title, I can look it up, but I think the imperialism of Russian culture and imperialism. It's a big book, and it analyzes Russian literature. It talks about many things, and it was actually written 23 years ago, 2000. Still not quite a classical book, not well enough known. And of course, new books will appear. And that's one part of it. Look on oneself, and the Russian with difficult kind of optics, changing the way of looking. And as an artist, for me, it's very important. The notion of vision and looking is a very important term and subject when we talk about culture. And the second thing, of course, to study other cultures and see what other cultures that's been subject to colonization have to offer. But again, that's the same thing. We know that Ukrainian people or Polish people or Kazakh people have been studying Russian literature and Dostoevsky for decades, if not centuries. But Russians never had to study any local, any other, even when it's local, when Russians living within, I don't know, Kazakhstan, Ukraine never bothered to learn not only what the culture of the country they lived in, and it became a big problem, as we know, in the Baltic countries and in Ukraine itself. It's also a big blind spot when we think of ourselves. Our ego is so big that it also prevents us from seeing other people. When I'm here, I occupy the whole screen. I can't see anything else. So I think this is the double take, and it's a normal procedure that all the imperial culture has undergone, but Russia managed to escape, even within the discourse of post-colonial studies in Slavistic and Russian studies, somehow managed to evade. And Russian myth was also a vehicle to evade decolonization.
Thank you. Thank you, Galina, for asking. That's important question. While we're waiting on other questions, I really have to ask only one right now. Very obvious. How do you respond to people within Russian culture who claim that they are also victims of this war?
So this is a very delicate and, of course, very painful subject. And I constantly come across very, let's say, put it diplomatic, painful reactions when I state and other people state that Russians are not the main victims of this war. But the self-victimization, which is true, Russians, especially Russian intellectuals, Russian writers, Russian culture, Russian dissident culture, underground art, he's always been subject to persecution. But it also became a means of escaping responsibility, infantilization. Actually, I wrote about it. It was a Russian article. I'm about to publish it in English, this essay about the attachment theory, attachment deficiency, that this is a syndrome known in orphans and people with deprivation who be deprived of parental care and love. And this is something we see at a greater scale within Russia. People who don't feel loved enough, who are persecuted, who've been oppressed since childhood. They tend to grow as a double thinkers. On one hand, they always feel themselves victims, truly. On the other hand, they manipulate this victimization to present themselves as victims. And it's a very delicate boundary, and it's very difficult to tell one from another, because this is a thing that's a complex. And on the other hand, as soon as you start to doubt, at any sign of doubt that somebody is a victim, this person becomes very, very aggressive. This victimization and aggression in the same, again, in the same personality is very typical for the RAD, reactive attachment disorder. And we see it at large now in Russian society especially within the intellectual strata of anti-war Russians, who claim, and sometimes claim very aggressively, even in the Western, from the Western stage, in the intellectual stage, in the cultural stage, they claim their place as victim. And it sounds paradoxical, but that's how it is. And I think it's a very deeply rooted thing of the many generations of trauma who started to use, maybe subconsciously, for survival, this trauma as a method, and this image of the victim as also as a way of surviving, as a survival tactics. And that's why when somebody, a very easy test, if somebody claims or start to doubt this status, what is a reaction is aggression.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Venetian Manifesto that you have read and interpreted for us today is, of course, the powerful document. It was only released last week, as I understand.
Yes,
And
yes.
it is very fresh. And what do you see as further steps following this release of this document from the like-minded people?
Like we're now, we have, we're looking at the signatures people just sign, also seeing, for many people, seeing their way of seeing that they're not alone in this way. They're also very motivating by itself. But of course, we're not stopping with just signatures. We see people who want to analyze, write and deconstruct myths, propaganda, either direct or indirect. Because direct propaganda, Putin propaganda, a lot of people write about it, that war is peace, all this Orwellian says war is peace, freedom is captivity, slavery, etc., etc. And it's, but there is a much more subtle propaganda, for instance, where the victims, Russian, are still in the center, but as a victims this time, and not as aggressors. And there are a lot of things. So what we're trying to build an online platform, a website that could accumulate people that want to work, and also give source of information for people who want to learn more on how Russian propaganda of Russia is present on the Western stage, in Western media, in Western discourse, how the political narratives are somehow invisibly influenced by Russianism, propaganda of Russianism. Sometimes they're just keywords that start to appear and reappear. Like a friend of mine told me recently that in Germany, for instance, some terms that are obviously second double translation from Russian start to appear in the political discourse of certain representatives of certain parties, which is a linguistic sign of the influence, which otherwise may be invisible. So what we want to build a group that will work on this, on the construction and of analysis, clear, and making it maybe more evident, more obvious to people in the English-speaking, French-speaking, Italian-speaking. There's a lot of people are working on that in trying to fight this hidden informative war that is going behind the scene. It's there's nothing new that Putin and Russia put a lot of effort and money in funding disagreement and propaganda in the Western states. Other things are, as I said, as I already said, is decolonization and education on and the colonial studies. Some people still have big hopes that other people maybe from over don't believe in, that there could be still some possibility to work with Russians within Russia to make not to maybe ignite protests. It's impossible at that stage, of this scale of repression, but maybe sabotage, like silent can be still possible. There's anything that would influence the war, whether it's corruption, sabotage, or anything that would reduce the number of missiles and destroying and killing people will be also a result. And we know we have a project of people wanting to work on this. And there are a lot of other interviews, video, a lot of ideas. So we're just trying to look at what people have to offer and think together to, we're thinking in the present, we think we need to do it today, but of course it's aimed to the future to build the guarantees. This will end and there will be some political guarantees, hopefully, for Ukraine, but there also should be a cure, not a temporary solution. You don't take the Tylenol to put the fever down temporary and then we'll have another full-scale invasion somewhere in 20 years or 50 years or whatever. We need to cure this disease definitively. That's what the belief is.
Thank you. I know there are many questions, but one more from myself. Briefly, can you please tell us about your own activities? I know that in the very first days of war, you were out on the streets of Venice informing people of what happened, but you live in Italy almost for 20 years. So what is going on about helping Ukraine around you in Italy? How do the people of Europe react right now? What can be done?
Yeah, like now, of course, it's been a first wave of great condolences and help. And we had a lot of refugees, people who fled the war, were witnessing the first buses start to arrive and the cars, and people terrified with terrified dogs and cats like everywhere. I think the beginning of March already, we saw the first people who were direct witnesses. A lot of people. Italy, historically, over the last 30 years, is a big Ukrainian diaspora, and of course, Ukrainians are helping Ukrainians, Italians are helping Ukrainians, but there's also, and all of us were involved in this activity last year, but now we are facing problems of a different kind. These problems remain. We have people need to go to school, to go to doctors, to learn the language. A lot of people want to come back to stay in Ukraine with their husbands. As you know, the men can't leave Ukraine. So I know quite a number of families with young children who wanted to go back to Ukraine, and which is not safe over, but wives want to stay by their husbands, or at least they want their children to see their fathers. Well, every story is a tragedy, and the drawing itself is really should be, the scale of it, as you know better than me, is unimaginable. Also, fortunately enough, in this, we had elections last October in Italy, and we were terrified by the results of the right-wing whistle on the almost fascist government, but who proved, actually, our prime minister proved to be much more central and very much supporting to the Ukraine. So the arms go to Ukraine, and Italy here supports Ukraine very directly and very firmly. What are obviously the first protests and first instinctive reactions. Now what we're trying to do is to build the consciousness and awareness. A lot of people are tired of the war, and there's been Italy is traditionally quite interested in Russian money, involved in Russian money. So there are a lot of things going behind the scene, a lot of Putinists, maybe not direct Putinists, but pro-Russian narrative circulating that also we don't, yes, of course, we condemn the war, we condemn the crimes, who condemned Russian invasion, but also Ukraine itself they could have stopped the war. Italian, this what I called fake pacifism is quite diffused and quite popular in the public opinion, also in Italy. And what I have to do, and what my friends and colleagues start to do, is to make even a simple example. The people understand that if somebody breaks in your house, kills your wife, rapes your daughter, and then you say, no, okay, give him that room, he will live peacefully with you from now on. It's unbelievable. But people do want peace, and their understanding of peace is sometimes very, very much influenced by Russian propaganda, unfortunately, which has all this Russian money coming to Italy over the last decades.
Yes, we can see even from this side of Atlantic that this is a big problem in Europe, which was so charmed by Russian money over decades, that it's very hard for people to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
We welcome, we know we've been here for an hour, and we welcome more final questions from our guests, please. I'm glad to have some live guests. Please open your microphone if you want to ask a question. We are very honored to have Katya Margolis speaking in English to our international audience, and especially to American viewers. Larry, please. Larry Sherray is our producer, and he's here in West Virginia. Larry, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Katya. Could you comment on the search engine Yandex and the danger that perhaps Russian citizens are in if that information is getting out to Russian security services? And can anyone find your information in Russia, or is it just thoroughly blocked by the authorities?
It is no. It is Russians use VPN to go to out in internet, but they can be connected. All these sites are totally available. The problem now with the contemporary Russian provider is different from this of the Soviet Union, where all the information sources were blocked. Everything is open, but the strategy is different. It's just to mix truth and lies, black and white, to the state of non-recognition. And the whole state of mind of the contemporary Russian society is indifference, passivity, and inability to discern, to tell the truth from fake, and also lack of interest. Everyone is kind of tired, and nobody tells the truth. And of course, our authorities and Putin is not very good, but also the West that lies. Everyone is playing the dirty games. We stay out of politics. And this depolitization and decivilization, I would say, of Russian society, it's been the strategy. So the availability of the real information is not the solution. There should be, unfortunately, what is lacking, the will to search and look for this information and want to internalize it.
Thank you very much, Katya. Any more questions, please, before we go to final segment? Panel or viewers, please. We covered enormously important, enormous spectrum of questions. I'm sure there will be others, and we would alert our viewers to what follows on social media. Most of the social media where the manifesto appears and other comments, as I mentioned, is in Russian language. And if there will be any websites given the same information in English, we'll also spread out the word across the world.
But
But
the
again, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just
Sure.
said this site, the website itself, Stop Russianism. Now it's just the manifesto will build a permanent site, but the manifesto is there already in 8 languages, and we have the translation for the 15 languages. So it is available in all European languages and in many other languages. So this is the prime, and it's searchable, and hopefully we'll try to let more people know about it.
Thank you, and we are glad to be part of it. As I said, the document is called the Venetian Manifesto, and we had Katya Margolis with us today for our 77th weekly meeting of M-Ukraine Discussion Group. Thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts, and we wish you all the very best in everything that you are doing. I want to say a couple of words to our viewers in Ukraine, which we have been doing for all these months. Дорогі брати і сестри в Україні, ми тримаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог береже вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня ми прощаємось. Слава Україні!
Героям слава! Дякую.
Дякуємо.
And
Thank you very much.
thank you everyone for having me.